Hey guys, we're still in Mark 15, where Jesus has gone from this really late night trial before the Sanhedrin to this really early morning trial before Pilate, where the chief priests have brought all these false accusations up against Jesus, but Jesus doesn't say anything. And Pilate's just amazed that Jesus is not defending himself. In fact, he asked him, "Aren't you going to say anything? Don't you see how many things they've accused you of?" But Jesus remained silent because he knows that if he was to say something, if he was to defend himself, that Pilate would let him go. And Pilate almost does. See, Pilate knows that Jesus is innocent, and Pilate understands the reason why they've brought him before him is because of jealousy, because of envy. And so let's pick up in our reading. We're Mark 15 and verse 6. Now at the feast, he was accustomed to releasing one prisoner to them, whomever they requested. And there was one named Barabbas, who was chained with his fellow rebels. They committed murder in the rebellion. Then the multitude, crying aloud, began to ask him to do just as he always done for them. But Pilate answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" For he knew that the chief priest had handed him over because of envy. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd, so that he should rather release Barabbas to them. Every year at the time of the Passover, they had a custom where the governor would release a political prisoner back to the people. And when they started asking for it, I think Pilate thought, all right, this is an opportunity to have Jesus released. So he said, here's your choices. You have Jesus, a man who's innocent of everything that you've accused him of, who's done nothing guilty of death. And Barabbas, this punk, this guy who's guilty of things like insurrection and murder. I'm assuming that he led some kind of rebellion against the Roman government and ended up killing people in the process. So he's a horrible guy who's done some horrible things. And he's done things like murder. He's taken life. But when you compare him with Jesus, the only thing he's guilty of is giving life. You know, he's released people from the bondage of their illnesses and sicknesses and their sin. It's quite the comparison. And so Pilate says, you choose. And who do they choose? They choose to release Barabbas over Jesus. I'm assuming, I could be wrong, but I'm assuming they were planning on crucifying 3 different men that day. Barabbas and the 2 thieves. But Jesus took his place. You know, and even if he wasn't going to be hanging that day, he was going to be hanging at some point. You think about it. We're the Barabbas in the story. You know, we're the ones guilty, not Jesus. We're the ones deserving of death because of our crimes, not Jesus. It was while we were still sinners and while we were enemies of God that Jesus died in our place so that we wouldn't have to. I think this is an incredible way of looking at the story. But here's the question. How was Pilate going to determine what he's going to do with Jesus now? We'll look at the next verse, in verse 12. It says, Pilate answered and said to them again, "What then do you want me to do with him whom you call the King of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Crucify him." And then Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they cried out all the more, "Crucify him." And so Pilate, wanting to gratify the crowd, released Barabbas to them. And he delivered Jesus after he had scourged him to be crucified. So how did Pilate decide what he's going to do? He asked the crowd. Could you imagine a judge asking the plaintiff what the verdict should be for the defendant? That doesn't even make sense. You know what they're going to say. Instead of giving the verdict, he just says, "You tell me what to do with your king." They said, "Crucify him." He says, "Why? What evil has he done?" They said, "Crucify him." Like he's trying to argue with them, trying to get them to the right verdict. I think he's just trying to wash his hands of this man's innocent blood. But at the same time, he wants to please the crowd more than he wants to actually give the just verdict that he knows he needs to give. And so Pilate buckles under pressure. It says that he released Barabbas. Then he had him scourged, which was a horrible thing. It wasn't just a whip. It was a whip with metal and glass tied on the end, which would just rip down the back of the person. It would just leave them with a bloody mess. And then he handed him over to be crucified. It was a really, really dark day.